welcome back to another episode of eTail Unplugged. This is Leo and
Liz Robillard here. And Leo, it's so good to see you again. I know we've been on a bit of a hiatus since eTail Palm Springs, and I mean see you again on the podcast. Obviously, I sit across from your beautiful face every day, which is truly, truly a pleasure. Yeah, we had a fantastic Palm Springs show in February, end of February, and I'm actually already working on Palm Springs 26, which I can't believe we just got started on research. But Leo, you've got another eTail event coming up, eTail London. Tell the audience a little bit about what's in store.
yes, it's eTail all year round, pretty much. As you all know, eTail London is coming up right around the corner, June the 24th and the 25th. We have exciting keynotes coming in from IKEA, from TikTok as well. But I will say that we do have a special guest for today's episode, right, Liz? We have the one and only Ryan McClurkin, who's the Chief Analytics Officer of JTV. At eTail Palm Springs this year, just 2 months away, he had a very engaged audience, I will say. So I'm excited to see some of the takeaways from this episode with Ryan.
He brought down the house. It was one of those like camera out moments, you know what I mean? Every single slide, everyone had their phones out taking pictures. So super excited that he agreed to join us on the podcast today, and we'll get chatting with him in a second. Ryan, hi, welcome to eTail Unplugged. How's it going?
Good, good. Thank you. I'm excited to be here and participate and doing well. How are you?
We're doing great. I'm doing great. Leo, how are you doing?
Fantastic. Ryan, it's always a pleasure to see you. Welcome back to eTail. You've been with us throughout the year, so it's always a pleasure getting a chance and opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for
Yeah,
joining us.
absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Ryan, for those in our audience who haven't had the pleasure of seeing you speak at our shows, tell us a little bit about you, a little bit about what you do, and yeah, let's get
Yeah,
started there.
yeah, absolutely. So I come from the advanced analytics background, and really in not just reporting, but truly advanced analytics, machine learning, customer modeling, lifetime value modeling, and primarily in the performance marketing space as well. And so I've been at a couple various different retailers throughout my about 15-year career, and really in the advanced analytics space, come from an economics background and really the applied economics side and how you apply that to the direct-to-consumer world. And really in the last 10 years have dived really deep into the performance marketing aspect of it, and how your marketing may be impacting not just immediate kind of value, but your future value and all those flaws associated with that space. And so I have a deep background in that space and kind of where I come from the advanced analytics side.
And we're super excited to dig into that a little bit today because we really do want to focus on the analytics of it all, the measurement of it all, which I know is something that a lot of brands, a lot of retailers, a lot of marketers do struggle with. So we kind of want to start there and start with the basics a little bit. Ryan, tell us, what is your current theory on metrics, marketing
Yeah.
metrics, and what marketers are measuring?
Yeah. So throughout my career, and when you talk about metrics, I really at these different brands and retailers, every brand and retailer wants to focus on these different metrics, right? And they want to maximize revenue, or they want to maximize customer generation, or new customer generation and retention, and so they're chasing all these metrics. But I have this theory that really what you're chasing is actually the total lifetime value of the customer base, right? And when you think about LTV, and if you ever get into like LTV modeling, you're really modeling like retention, you're modeling acquisition, like all of those metrics play a huge role in the total lifetime value of your customer base. And so these retailers, what they're doing is you're trying to maximize that potential future value that is stored inside your customer base, right? And when retailers do this, the way to think about it is every single consumer you've ever had participate in your business has some form or fashion of a future value associated with them at any given point in time. And the goal of an organization is really to perpetually expand that total pool of lifetime value, just in perpetuity. That's how you create compound year-over-year growth. And what happens is you really do it in a simplistic format, one of two ways. You either acquire new customers, which are future revenue streams that you did not have, and it's not just an immediate transaction, right? That typically when a consumer participates with a brand, you hope to get some type of lifetime out of them, right? And so new customers are revenue streams that you didn't have. And then retention is the other effort in getting your existing customer base more loyal, coming back and purchasing with you, increasing those, I'm going to call them the RFM metrics, the recency, the frequency, the monetary value, like nurturing those metrics to not just consume their LTV, but also grow their LTV, right? And if you think about marketing, right, and think about advertising, you could pretty much boil any advertising or marketing effort you do down to one of those two things. You're either doing marketing to acquire new customers, or you're doing marketing to retain your existing customer base and get them to come back and spend more. And, you know, a lot of marketers be like, oh, well, I spend in the upper funnel for brand awareness and to create brand awareness. And no, what you're really doing is you're trying to reach an audience that doesn't know your brand so they become a customer of your brand, right? And that would be new customer acquisition. And so in a very simplistic format, you know, when I look at the space, I see that, you know, all marketing efforts can really be boiled down to really it's you're trying to acquire new customers, which is a future revenue stream, or you're trying to retain your existing customer base, which would, you know, grow that LTV of the existing customer base in perpetuity. And what you hope to do as an organization is grow that total pool of LTV in perpetuity to create growth for the organization long term.
And Ryan, so speaking of customer acquisition and retention, you know, nowadays the customer journey is getting far more connected and more complex at the same time, right? So
Yep.
for marketers, this places them under pressure to show a good return on their investment, right? So what are some of the problems that you think most marketers encounter in the marketing measurement space?
Yeah, so in my career, I really think like I boil them down to really three major flaws that we see in this space when you're trying to measure your marketing efforts. The first one is a little more of a typical, I'm going to call it a finance principle, okay? You could think of it as kind of activity-based costing or how you're allocating the cost of your efforts to the benefit that they are generating. And what happens in marketing and advertising it's really an investment. What you're doing is when you're spending the money today, you're buying a future benefit or a future order or a future customer. Yet almost all of the traditional marketing measurement methods that exist in the space, they often match cost and benefits in the same period of time, right? So I see a lot of reports. I'll see a ton of reports where they say, oh, how much revenue did I generate in the past 2 weeks? And then how much marketing dollars did I spend in the last 2 weeks? And the reality is those are not necessarily connected. Like the benefit that you create in the past 2 weeks is a function of like many previous periods of ad spend. They may have come from 3 months ago you started talking to that consumer, right? And that lack of cost allocation, meaning I'm allocating the cost of that benefit to the benefit itself, it doesn't exist well in this space, and it creates all kinds of friction inside the organization. So this is the issue that it creates. So there's really two primary friction points that it creates. The first friction point is when you are fluctuating ad spend. So let's say that I get into a little recessionary period or my business starts hurting a little bit, and let's say I was spending $1 million a week, so I can do the math easy, right? And you come in and we say, hey, we've got to cut the marketing budget by 20%, and you go down to 800,000, right? What happens in organizations is it becomes a microscope, right? Like we say, okay, we want to know if that cut in marketing is hurting our revenue, right? And so what happens is the next week everybody will look at the revenue and they say, okay, you know, did our revenue fall? And maybe 2 weeks later, did our revenue fall, right? And what they see is the revenue may not change. Like the revenue may, you know, like say we're generating 10 million a week, right? That revenue may stay perfectly constant because what happens is that revenue you're generating was a function of many previous periods ad spend when you're spending $1 million, right? But then on a piece of paper, what you see is I'm spending 800,000, I'm still generating 10 million, and everybody goes, well, I knew marketing didn't work for me, right? Because your ROAS goes up, your revenue stays the same, and I'm spending less. But then like 13 weeks down the road, 16 weeks, 20 weeks down the road, your revenue starts to fall apart, and everyone's wondering why. And it's because you don't have that cost allocation done right, and you're not really allocating the cost of that benefit to the benefit itself. You're just allocating over periods of time, and if you don't have the right weighting curve or time decay curve associated with it, you're not able to get the response done properly. And so that's one major friction point. The other major friction point is when you start increasing spend. So like, let's say let's say I'm going to test a new marketing tactic and campaign, and I turn it on for $20,000 a week, right? Everybody wants to know how that campaign's working. How is it doing? How's it doing? Right? Well, the reality is you may not receive the benefit of that $20,000 for a long period of time, right? Yet you come in the next week and you say, okay, I spent 20 grand. What did I get for it? You may only be able to measure against a fraction of that spend initially, right? And so what happens is, like, initially the campaigns may not look good, right? Like from on a piece of paper, and that's because your cost allocation isn't done properly. You're allocating too much of the cost up front, and you're trying to measure against $20,000 in spend, but you don't have the benefit from it yet. And so, I see those are the two major friction points of like the first major flaw. The second major flaw deals around attribution and how the majority of marketers are still relying on last touch click-based attribution models. I see it all over the place. GA4, Adobe, you name it, and they default into last click. And once you see a customer journey, like if you are actually visualize and be able to see from a data perspective all of the touch points that lead to an order, you would never use a last touch model. And then if you have the opportunity to see view through, right, where you actually can see the view through impact and you can see it at a very granular level, you would realize the number of marketing touches that to create an order, especially like a new customer order, is substantially more than you would think, let alone some type of last touch click-based model. So I think that really limits the brand's ability to measure their marketing efforts. And then the third one has to do with lifetime value. And a lot of marketers lack visibility into how their marketing efforts are impacting the long-term value of their customer base. Okay, because like I said, when you're doing marketing, what you're trying to do is propagate future revenue streams, right? And marketers don't have in front of them a solution that says, hey, okay, I'm doing these things in marketing. How is it impacting the future of my customer base, not just the immediate revenue? And so that lack of lifetime value integration is a huge blind spot for a lot of brands, but it's probably the most important metric that you could measure.
The first time that I heard you speak, sort of like a light bulb moment for me when it was like, why would you be looking at what you had spent in the past 2 weeks of, it's just like, why would that be your, total picture of spend? So I just remember that being a real light bulb moment for me. So I
Yeah, and that's the issue. Like when you don't have the right visibility, you can't maximize on lifetime value, right? So it's like people always ask, how do these three problems kind of, how do they impact your LTV? Well, the problem is if you can't measure how your marketing efforts are impacting LTV, it creates a major disconnect in the organization, because you really should be your organization should be trying to maximize LTV. But if you can't measure how, one of the biggest budgets in your entire organization, which is typically marketing, is impacting those efforts, and it's the primary driver of LTV, right? Then, that lack of visibility, it just creates all kinds of friction. And so, I always say a utopia for a marketer, like when I interact with CMOs and the actual executors of a marketer, I would say the utopia is actually how that marketer, if they could understand how every ad dollar spent changes the incremental lifetime value of the customer, that would be utopia, right? Because you would know exactly how much to spend, what your return on investment is, how it's impacting your future value. Should I be increasing spend? Am I oversaturated, et cetera? If you could understand that, right? Incremental is a huge key word there, right? But how every ad dollar you spend is changing incremental customer lifetime value, it would be a huge unlock for a lot of brands.
let's talk about that utopia, right? Like how can marketers kind of get to that MarTech stack? What's the framework for getting to that perfect picture?
Yeah, and that's where I think every brand is in a different spot with this, right? So every brand is at a different spot in how their marketing measurement is set up. Some more sophisticated than others, some still elementary. And so, one of the ways that I think about this is just from like where should you be trying to go, right? Like what should your MarTech stack look like? And the MarTech stack always starts with data capture. Okay, so kind of a data collection layer and how you're capturing data. And in order to do proper measurement, I view that you really need, I'm going to call it kind of three primary sources of data. Okay, the first one is all of your ad platform, your advertiser platform data. And when I think about that, that's metadata, that's Google data, that's the programmatic company's data, your email, your text, all all the places that you're doing the advertising, you want data feeds from them that are feeding into your centralized kind of data platform. And that's one critical element because you need to know how much you're spending, how many impressions are you generating, what your clicks look like, is your CPMs changing or your CPCs changing? You need good visibility into that just to see if the market demand and your delivery metrics are changing, right? Um, and to do attribution, you need how much you're spending, right, on those campaigns. And so that's one piece of primary data. The second piece of data is what I call kind of a marketing touch point event tracking data. It starts with first party data collection, okay, having really good practice around first party data collection and the right pixels on your website and that you're trying to collect every touch point that your business has with a consumer, right? And when you see those touch points, you'll be able to then, see that, oh, well, one of those touch points was my meta ad that impacted them, was a Google ad that impacted them, was a programmatic ad that impacted them, right? And so having great first party touch point event tracking is a really critical start. And there's a number of solutions in the space to do that. I mean, the traditional one you would think of as kind of like a CDP type solution, right? Like that's good first party data collection. But there's a lot of solutions in the space to do event tracking. Okay. And on top of that event tracking, the first party event tracking, partnering with your advertisers to get third party data feeds too. Any type of log level data you can get from an advertiser is critical to build into that journey, right? And then the third piece is sales and transaction data. You know, a lot of ad platforms, they report on a pixel that's on the website. Well, the reality is that's not how businesses report revenue. Um, it just isn't. You have cancels, you have returns. Pixels can fire twice if you refresh your confirmation page. Well, that pixel doesn't dedupe magically. And so, one of the major friction points I've come across in my career is just the amount of revenue and or whatever metric you're optimizing, whether it's revenue, whether it's a lead gen event, that thing, that benefit that you're trying to create, to make sure that you're using the source of truth for that, like a single source of truth for that, not some pixel-based, thing on your website that's firing if you're going to report a different amount of revenue coming from the actual platform itself. And so, those, I'm going to call those primary sources of data, right? Advertiser platform data, event tracking data, sales and transaction data, or the benefit data, whether it could be lead gen, for example, right? Having that in a single centralized data platform is so critical, and trying to automate that as much as possible. There's a lot of manual tasks that I see in the marketplace. Like, I've known many teams that just, they have somebody dedicated to manually grabbing all the app platform data and putting it in an Excel file and sending it to an executive. And it's an incredibly manual process, error
Yikes.
prone, but having that into a centralized data warehouse is so critical. That's really where it starts, right? And you have to have really good practice around that. The second piece is leveraging those data sources to build predictive lifetime value models. Okay. And when I talk about LTV, a lot of companies and a lot of individuals, when they talk about lifetime value, they talk about it in a historical sense, meaning how much has Ryan spent with me through his lifetime? When I talk about LTV and future value, I like to talk about it in the predictive sense. How much am I going to spend with you in the future? And that's it's a different framework because, like I said, when you're doing marketing, when you're doing advertising, you're trying to impact how much I'm going to spend with you in the future, not necessarily how much I spent with you in the past, right? What I've spent with you in the past is a function of previous efforts, but how much I'm going to spend with you in the future, are you changing my trajectory as a customer through your marketing efforts? And so having predictive LTV models is very critical as well. And those get a little harder in terms of the modeling techniques. That's where advanced analytics really comes into play. There's a couple different techniques out there, but Bayesian statistics is one of the primary techniques there. But that's kind of you need a foundation for calculating a hedgehog metric in your business, right? And I always think about it from a predictive perspective, not necessarily a historical, because there's so many use cases that go even beyond marketing measurement with predicted LTV. Like, you're able to see consumers that become high value more quickly. Like somebody, like, say you had a loyalty program with a threshold of, say, a $5,000 spend in a year, right? You may have a new customer that's going to be worth way more than that, but they haven't gotten there yet. And you can see that. You can nurture that customer right into that loyalty program, right? So there's all kinds of use cases around predictive LTV. And so having a predictive LTV model and that advanced analytics layer is so critical. And then the next thing I think about is marketing intelligence. Okay. And marketing intelligence, I think about three primary views that I love to have. One is a summary view of ad platform metrics. So once again, I've seen this done very manually, right? But being able to kind of effortlessly compare cross-platform metrics like CPM, CPC, click-through rate, the delivery metrics, okay, through time. I want to see it through time too, because I want to know, for example, is my cost per thousand impressions, my CPM, is it changing, right? Like, has it gotten more expensive to reach the same amount of consumers? Like, that's a very important thing as a marketing leader to know, right? Because I may need to make adjustments in my mix to keep my CPM stable, right? But having that effortless view is so critical. And you'll be amazed at the number of organizations that don't have that view. They cannot simply log in and go, what's my CPM doing over time? What's it doing in Facebook? What's it doing in Google? What's it doing in programmatic? What's it doing here? Right? But how is it changing over time? Or CPC or click-through rate? You know, I personally do not rely on ad platform metrics or conversion metrics. You know, the revenue, the new customers, because they're not doing the deduplication. You know, you'll have an order that exists across multiple ad platforms if multiple ad platforms touched it. So you duplicate your revenue across the platforms, and if you summed up all the revenue across the platforms, your revenue would be 3 times as high as it is, right? So, you know, I don't like to use that platform metrics from a conversion perspective. I like to use them from a delivery perspective. How efficient is the delivery of your media over time and across the different app platforms and campaigns, and being able to study it at that level. The second thing in the marketing kind of intelligence stack is multi-touch attribution, and multi-touch attribution is a very I'm gonna call it a little controversial at times, because if it's not done well, people just say it doesn't work, right? They're like, oh, it doesn't work. MTA doesn't work. It actually does if it's done right, and it's a very critical view. But you have to have really good data collection practices to make it work right. Like that. I think where companies fail is they build MTA without really paying attention to how they're collecting first-party and third-party data. And so what happens is their MTA is not very good because they're not able to like build the right identity graph and connect the events. And so what happens is they say, oh, well, MTA doesn't work. Well, no, it actually does work, but you have to build it the right way. And when I think about MTA, you know, I think about you have to build an MTA that overcomes those three flaws, right? You have to overcome this cost out. The way I think about MTA is when I look at a period of time and I look at the benefit, like let's say I'm looking at the past 2 weeks, and I say how much benefit was in that past 2 weeks, you know, whether it was revenue, whether it was lifetime value, et cetera, right? I ask the question, how much did it cost me to generate that benefit, right? When I'm looking at revenue in the past 2 weeks, how much did it cost me to generate that revenue? That's a very different question than how much money did I spend in the past 2 weeks, right? When I look at the benefit and I said, hey, I generated $2 million in revenue in the past 2 weeks, and then I say, how much did it cost me? The cost may have come from 3 weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, right? But MTA has got to be done at a very granular grain, at the conversion grain, right? And you have to be able to look at that conversion and say, what were the marketing touch points attached to this, and how much did they cost you, right? And the second thing about the MTA, besides that piece of it, is you really need to build lifetime value into that MTA as well. Like, what is the impact that those marketing efforts are not having just on immediate revenue, but how are they impacting the future value of your consumer? And so having those type of performance metrics is so critical. And while MTA is not incrementality, what it is though is showing you that direct attribution to your marketing efforts of immediate revenue impact and future value impact, right? And that to me is still a very critical view, especially when you're talking with the leadership of your organization and they're talking about the efficacy of marketing and advertising. You want to know the impact. Like, these marketing dollars are attached to this much revenue and this much future value. Like, that's a critical piece. The
So,
third piece is, oh, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, you touched upon data, right? So I remember clearly one of the takeaways from your session at eTail Palm Springs this year during the audience Q&A was around data, right? And looking at a future in which cookies are depreciating, third-party cookies, and its implications on trackable data, what have you seen from marketers now who are successfully preparing for that paradigm shift?
Yeah, so in that first party data collection, you got to be really good. Server side integration is critical, like server side pixel integration. Okay. Um, the privacy laws treat server side pixel integration differently than browser side cookies. Okay, so actually, browser-based cookies changed many years ago when Apple first started wiping the Apple iOS started wiping browser-based cookies, I think within 24 hours, right? And that basically just wrecked that whole entire. If you had an identity graph built on browser, kind of the client-side cookie, your identity graph got wiped out, right? But the reality is, with first-party event tracking, at any given time somebody lands on your website, you're collecting between, I'm going to call it 20 and 40 different identifiers, and if you have a server-side integration with that pixel and it looks like the server is issuing the cookie, those can persist for much longer periods of time. Now, they don't persist cross-device, right? Like the user still has to identify, but you've got to be sophisticated in how you build your identity graph. Like, are you simply using a pixel, or sorry, a cookie, or are you using, a combination of metrics such as their IP address, their device ID, their screen resolution, etc., to build that graph? I've seen some pretty sophisticated graphs built with, there's actually a technique called graph databases, where it basically essentially predicts the probability of somebody being the same. And so probabilistic stitching is so critical as well in the space, right? If you try to rely on what's called deterministic stitching, I have a perfect match between metrics, you'll limit your ability to stitch people together, okay? But probabilistic stitching, which uses kind of graph database algorithms to predict, it'll basically look at a series of metrics and say, hey, we think with 95% that that's Leo, right? Even though it's not a perfect match, we think 95%. And then you can set the threshold to which you say, I'm going to call that event Leo, right? Like, I'm going to call that event Leo. I'm going to call that event Ryan. I'm going to call that event Liz, right? And then what happens is your identity graph becomes more sophisticated, and your ability to see the user over long periods of time becomes enhanced. But having good practice in that first party data sense is critical. And like how you're building the identity graph becomes really critical, especially as the privacy ramps up. But there's a lot of metrics that you can still piece together. There are algorithms you can use to do it in a probabilistic fashion. So there's a lot of, there are still solutions in this space, but yeah, certainly the privacy has threw a major chink in it from a browser side, cookie basis.
I mean, to go back to metrics really quick, can you tell us about the golden triangle of marketing measurement?
Yeah. So the third one is MMM.
Yeah.
And MMM, everybody loves talking about MMM, and MMM is a kind of a statistical technique to try to measure the incremental impact of your marketing efforts, right? The one little flaw with MMM is it sits a little higher than MTA. So MTA is really executionary at a campaign ad level, right? Whereas MMM is more at a channel and tactic level. Both are critically important. So when I look at the golden triangle marketing measurement, right, I actually think of three things. One is having really, really good practice around MTA. The second one is having really good practice around MMM. And then the third one is around incrementality. And there's a number of ways to execute incrementality. From a brand side, you can do geolocation incrementality and try to do geolocated ads and say, hey, I didn't advertise here, but I advertised here. Did I get a lift from a geo perspective? That's a very common way. But a lot of incrementality is actually done on the advertiser side, right? Where the advertiser is holding out, specific examples of audiences, and then they can tell you what the incremental impact was. But those three, triangulating those three in your business to see if they point in the same direction. They're not going to give you the same exact metrics, right? But are they pointing in the same direction, right? Like, does MMM say that, for example, your meta lower funnel advertising efforts are incremental, and then when you look at an MTA level, do they say something very similar? And then if you test their incrementality, does it say something similar, right? And making those budget adjustments and shifts and scale using those three components, MTA, MMM, and incrementality, becomes that golden triangle for making really smart marketing decisions. And because if they're pointing in the same direction, you probably should just get off your horse and go. I mean, it's summer. Get on your horse and go, because you're not guessing at that point, right? Like, if those three are pointing in the same direction, you're not guessing anymore. It's time to move and scale.
And with the golden triangle in mind, right? Any case studies that come to mind of marketers who've been successful with this?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and for brands I've been personally associated with, I've been with a brand that we scaled marketing spend from single digit to, we had about a 10x increase in marketing spend over a 2-year period, and a large amount of it being incremental. I've seen other brands that kind of have gone through this phase and created triple digit revenue year-over-year growth, almost triple digit new customer year-over-year growth. And these were pretty substantial brands too, where their revenue was already 11, 12 figures, and then they're creating kind of 50 to 150% growth in revenue and 50 to 150% growth in new customers. When you start to focus on that lifetime value aspect, you can really, really accelerate and hockey stick the growth curve, because you start to understand what's driving it, and you start to invest in areas that's really driving that LTV component, and that starts to create compound year-over-year growth. And so I've seen a few brands, and I've seen brands flip immediately from being flat to down year-over-year to being up substantially year-over-year once they start focusing on the right metrics and being able to measure them properly.
Ryan, we're coming up on time here, but
Yep.
any closing words, any closing thoughts? I mean, as always, you share the most comprehensive information, and you just always have such vital expertise. But I'm curious if you have any closing words, final thoughts for the eTail Unplugged audience.
Yeah, the biggest thing I would say is you can't be afraid as a brand to challenge the way in which, the measurement space and marketing has been done for 30 years. Okay. It's one of the big flaws that I see brands fall into, is that they just, it's been measured this way for 30 years, so that's the right way to measure it. There are much more sophisticated ways, and having that mindset and really trying to think with the end in mind, right? Like, if you're trying to get to maximizing your LTV and your predicted lifetime value of your customer base, how do you get there, right? And like having a framework in place to get there, but not being afraid to challenge that traditional last touch click-based attribution, right? And I see, it's funny, I see older marketers, they tend to fall into that trap. They just want to keep using that metric they've used for 20 or 30 years. But that's not the reality today. It's a giant spider web of how people are touched and the way in which people are marketed to and all the touch points that happen. And so don't be afraid to challenge those traditional ways, but have a framework set and how you think you should get there, and plan it out as an organization.
Amazing. As always, this was fantastic. Such a great conversation with you, Ryan. And we want to thank you so much for coming on and imparting your wisdom with our audience. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Ryan. Wow, so what an insightful conversation we just had right now, Liz, with Ryan McClurkin. I mean, one of my takeaways is all about the difference in total spend versus the actual customer acquisition cost. A lot to think about right there. What were one of your takeaways?
I mean, I love the thought that we kind of ended with, which is that there are so many ways for your customer to discover you, and just kind of making sense of, that storm cloud almost, what the funnel doesn't exist anymore. How are we really measuring where your customer is coming in? I don't envy the modern marketer with what they've got going on, but it does seem like Ryan really kind of has those answers. And again, that sort of, golden triangle of what it takes to get there and understand what's making the difference. So that's kind of what stood out to me. It's super impactful.
And speaking of the golden triangle, he also touched upon heavily on data, right? The importance and how critical data is for customer lifetime value. So excited to have him on board on this episode of eTail Unplugged and to share his insights with the audience.
Absolutely. And Leo, can you say a little bit about where people might next see Ryan speaking?
He'll be joining us at eTail London this summer, June the 24th and the 25th. So excited to have him and see him again in person in a couple of months.
Amazing. Well, Leo, as always, it's a pleasure to see you, and I'll see you next week in the office, but always a pleasure to see you virtually too. And thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of eTail Unplugged.